Okay, this week is Parshas Hachodesh. Now, this year, as just about every year, is dedicated in memory of Mr. Borg, whose yahrzeit is the 25th of Adar, and named Moshe ben Sana. I always mention he was a member of my shul, very devoted, very loyal, always was there to help out with the minyan, and loyalty was part of his being. And I always say that with European Jews, he was a European Jew, they had special qualities. It's not just that you can't describe those special qualities, and you had to have seen them. And it's unfortunate that the Jews of them, that the next generation, our generation, my generation, we are the children of the European Jews. The coming generations, they'll get something b'Masorah about what the European Jews were like, but it's very unfortunate that they won't have the experience of knowing them, because even b'Masorah, there's certain things to fully understand, to fully apprehend, you have to experience. And that generation, with many of that generation have passed away already, and the future generation future generations will not have the ability to experience a relationship with the Jews of Europe. I want to discuss Parshas Hachodesh. Now, when we take a look at Parshas Hachodesh, so it starts off with the mitzvah of the calendar. Hachodesh hazel lachem rosh chadashim rishon hu lachem lechadshei hashana. Under ideal circumstances, these are not the circumstances that we have today, but under ideal circumstances, the new month was proclaimed by the Beis Din on the basis of the sighting of the moon. Today, for many reasons, we have the calendar that was established. I'll probably touch on that a little bit later. But under ideal circumstances, it's the sighting of the moon and the proclamation of the Beis Din based on the sighting of the moon that declared the new month. And that mitzvah is contained in the Parsha Chodesh, in the second pasuk. It starts Vayomer Hashem Moshe Aaron Beretz Mitzrayim Lemor. God spoke to Moshe and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, Hachodesh hazel lachem rosh chadashim. This month shall be for you the beginning of the months, because Chodesh Nisan is considered the first month. It shall be for you the first of the months of the year, because from the perspective of months, the year starts with Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Now, and then, after talking about the mitzvah of the calendar, of proclaiming the new month, the Torah then goes on to talk about the Korban Pesach, about the Passover sacrifices. And the Passover sacrifice was given that year for the first time the year of the redemption in Egypt. And most of the Kriya focuses on the mitzvah of giving the sacrifices. But in introducing the mitzvah of giving the sacrifice in Egypt, the Torah begins by telling us about the mitzvah of the calendar. So apparently, it would appear, I should say, that there is a special relationship between the mitzvah of the calendar, the proclaiming of the new month, and the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. It's true that in Egypt they had to get the lamb that was used for the Passover sacrifice on the 10th of the month, and it was sacrificed on the 14th, and it was eaten on the 15th. All that is true. But it seems that it's more. There is added reason. There's a special connection, more than just the day of the month that the mitzvah of the sacrifice had to be given to start off the laws of the giving of the sacrifice in Egypt, and for that matter, to a large degree, the mitzvah of giving the Passover sacrifice throughout the years, than just the fact that it had to be on a particular day of that month. So I'd like to know, what is the special connection between the mitzvah of proclaiming the new month, the mitzvah of the calendar, and the mitzvah of giving the Korban Pesach, of giving the sacrifice, the Passover sacrifice? Now, from the Mefarshim, from the people who spoke about it, it seems that my father would very much emphasize this point, that for the Jew to be really free, he first had to become a master of time. And it's more than just that. Now, I want to point out, Rosh Chodesh, the mitzvah of the calendar, Hachodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim, as Rashi points out at the beginning of Chumash Parshas, is the first mitzvah of the Torah. It's true that there are other mitzvahs mentioned in Chumash Parshas, but those mitzvahs remained obligatory upon us only because these parshios, these parts of the Torah that mentions these mitzvahs, let's say Bris Milah, Gid Hanoshe, Pruvu, the mitzvahs mentioned in Chumash Parshas remained and it re-became obligatory upon us only because these parshos were repeated at Sinai to the Jewish people. But Hachodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim, the mitzvah of the calendar, the mitzvah of proclaiming the new month, that mitzvah became obligatory for all generations. In those generations where it was done by the Bezdin meeting and proclaiming the new month, so that's the way it was done. Later generations, after the many years after the Churban, it was on the basis of the calendar, whichever way it was done. But that mitzvah was given. That mitzvah was given on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, on the 1st of Nisan, and that last year when they were in Egypt, the year of their freedom. And that mitzvah was a permanent mitzvah because of its revelation at that point. So the mitzvah of the calendar is the first mitzvah. And we could suggest, Rav Sadia Goen says that the Jewish people are different than the other nations of the world. Rav Sadia Goen says that the other nations of the world are nations by virtue of the fact that they have a country, that they have a land. The Jewish people, of course, it's very important for us to have a land. Eretz Yisrael is very important for the Jewish people, certainly for their sense of nationhood. But even throughout 2,000 years of Golus, 2,000 years of exile, they remain a nation because they are a nation even without a land, even when they don't possess a land. They are a nation by virtue of the Torah. And perhaps more than any other mitzvah, any of the other mitzvahs of the Torah, what keeps them united as a nation is the Yom Tovim, the holidays. And the holidays are based on the calendar. And by virtue, so we could understand the mitzvahs of the Torah. In other words, the Avos, the patriarchs, had Kedushas Yisrael. We have so many proofs for it. I know it's discussed in the Achronim whether the Avos were considered Jewish or not. But logically, it would be almost absurd to suggest that the patriarchs did not have Kedushas Yisrael, that the Shvatim did not have Kedushas Yisrael. How can you be a Levi or a Reuveni or a Shimoni? How could you be a member of the tribe of the Jewish people if you're not part of the Jewish people? So, but there was added Kedusha. My father would say that until Matan Torah, until the giving of the Torah, there was individual Kedusha. Each individual Jew had Kedusha, had sanctity as a Jew. But sanctity as a nation, they received at Sinai at the time of Matan Torah. But to a certain degree, we could suggest that Matan Torah began not just at Sinai. That was perhaps the completion of Matan Torah. But Matan Torah began when they received the first mitzvah, which was Hachodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim, the first mitzvah of the Torah. So the Jewish people, we could suggest that the Jewish people, the beginning of their formation as a nation, from a halachic perspective, began on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Now, it's very interesting. It might be a little bit of a side comment, but in the Haggadah we say, Yachol me Rosh Chodesh. I've mentioned this many times. I would think that the mitzvah of the recitation of the Haggadah, of talking about the Exodus from Egypt, should begin on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So Talmud Lomar Bayamahu. So the pasuk says, no, it has to be specifically on the night of the 15th of Nisan. But on the basis of logic, if not for a special indication in the Torah to the contrary. I would say the mitzvah of telling over to our children and our children's children about what happened in Egypt, about our redemption from Egypt, should begin on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. The question is why? Why would I have suggested such a thing? But the answer is the giving of the Torah. That represents the spiritual redemption of the Jew, whereas leaving Egypt represents the physical redemption of the Jew. So on the basis of logic, I would say that, and we know that there are elements in the Schiras Yitzrayim in telling over about the events of Egypt that focus on the spiritual redemption of the Jew. And of course, the physical redemption. We were slaves to power in Egypt, and God took us out with a strong hand and outstretched arm. But certainly the spiritual gula, the spiritual redemption, is more important than the physical redemption. So I would suggest, since the spiritual redemption began on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, this is the explanation I heard from my father, Zatzal. Began on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the Schiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, the talking about the events that took place in Egypt, the talking about the redemption of the Jew, should begin on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, Talmud Lomar, but there's an indication in the Torah by Yom Ahu. We have to combine the physical redemption with the spiritual redemption. The two came together, and because the two came together, by Yom Ahu, the mitzvah starts on the 15th, the night of the 15th of Nisan. So the redemption of the Jew, at least the spiritual redemption, began Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And we could identify it. In other words, the beginning of the Jewish people as a nation, which is dependent upon the Torah. The Jewish people as a nation exist by virtue of the Torah. To emphasize that point, the first mitzvah is given. The first mitzvah is given on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. On Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And more than any other mitzvah, the mitzvah of the Yomim Tovim is the mitzvah that in a sense unites the Jews wherever they'll be, when they're in Golus, when they're in exile, when they don't have a land. What holds them together as a nation is the Yomim Tovim. And the Yomim Tovim is proclaimed by the Jewish people. The Yom Tovim, the Yom Tovim is what gives them their identity as a nation. Jewish people are not just Judaism is not just a religion. It's nationhood combined with religion. But we are nation. What unites the Jew in one country with the Jew in another country, the Jew from one side of the ocean with the Jew from the other side of the ocean, is the Yom Tovim, the holidays. So nationhood, the Torah, and the freedom of the Jew, the spiritual freedom of the Jew, all come together. So when we give the Passover sacrifice, which is a demonstration of the freedom of the Jew. It begins with Hachodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim, with the mitzvah of the calendar. And it's interesting, this concept that Rosh Chodesh Nisan is the day of the first mitzvah of the day of the mitzvah of the calendar, which is also represents the Jewish people as a nation, could be seen from something that's mentioned in the Baal Torah, which is actually based on the opinion of the Rambam. The Torah says, and I've mentioned this before, Vayomer Hashem Moshe al Aaron beretz Mitzrayim lemor Hachodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim. This month shall be for you the beginning of all the months. It shall be for you the first of the months of the year. Dabru al kol adas b'nei Yisrael. Speak to the whole nation of the Jewish people, or to the whole assembly of Israel. And he asks, what's the connection between Rosh Chodashim, the mitzvah of the calendar, and Dabrel Kol Adas Yisrael? He says it's a hint to the fact that Kiddush Hachodesh, the proclamation of the new month, when they would proclaim the new month on the basis of the sighting of the moon, was dependent upon the Bezdin HaGodol, on the High Court of Israel. And the Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvos, he says that when could the Bezdin HaGodol proclaim the new month? The Bezdin HaGadol could proclaim the new. When could a Bezdin proclaim the new month on the basis of the sighting of the moon? Only if it was a Bezdin that was recognized by the Bezdin HaGadol, by the High Court of Israel, that it received license from the Bezdin HaGadol to proclaim the new month. But once the Bezdin HaGadol ceases to exist, so the calendar goes into effect. And the Ramban asks a question against the Rambam. He says, the Bezdin HaGadol had to sit in the Lishkas HaGazis, had to sit in a particular room in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple. And we know that 40 years before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the Bezdin HaGadol left its chamber in the Beis HaMikdash. And to a certain degree, they lost their special status as the High Court of Israel, as the Bezdin HaGadol. And yet we see for many generations after that, they continued to proclaim the new month on the basis of the sighting of the moon. And there was no Bezdin HaGadol around then to authorize the other Batei Dinim, the other courts, to proclaim the new month. So how could the Rambam say that when there is no Bezdin HaGadol, we cease to proclaim the new month on the basis of the sighting of the moon, and that the calendar automatically goes into effect? When 40 years before the Churban, before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the Bezdin HaGadol lost its special status. So by what power did the Batei Dinim, did the courts, who proclaim the new month have the authority to do so. And because of that, the Ramban disagrees with the Rabbi. However, my uncle explained that Beis Din Hagadol acts in two different capacities. One capacity that Beis Din Hagadol acts is as the final arbiter of Jewish law. And their proclamation about Jewish law has special status. And one who disagrees with them, depending on the manner of their disagreement, sometimes could even be viewed as a capital offense. But all that was only when the Beis Din Hagadol, the High Court of Israel, was in its special chamber in the Lishkas HaGazis in the temple. But that special judicial status that they had as a prerequisite, they're sitting in the Lishkas HaGazis. However, the Beis Din Hagadol, the High Court of Israel, also in regard to many halachos, in regard to many laws, in addition to their judicial capacity, had the status of representing the Jewish people. For example, the halacha is that certain wars required the consent of Beis Din Hagadol. And in the Rambam, there's a contradiction. In one place, the Rambam says it required the consent of Beis Din Hagadol. In another place, it's a contradiction between Hilchos Trumos HaMaishros and the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim. And in another place, he says it has to be with the consent of most of the Jews. And my uncle said, in theory, it has to be done with the consent of the Jewish people. But the Beis Din Hagadol represented the Jewish people. They acted on behalf of the Jewish people. So and in that capacity, the Jewish people, the Beis Din Hagadol, did not have to sit in the Lishkas HaGazis. Wherever they sat, or so long as they could meet and sit, so it was considered that Beis Din Hagadol was still in existence. So he says, wars that required the consent of the Jewish people, Beis Din Hagadol could act on behalf of the Jewish people even outside the Lishkas HaGazis. In wars, and also by Kiddush Hachodesh, Hachodesh Hazel Lechem, Lechem Mesura, it's given over to the Jewish people. The authorization to the Batei Dinim to proclaim the new month was given over to Jewish people. We say, Mekadesh Yisrael Bahazmanim. In the Shmoneh Esrei and Yontif and Rosh Chodesh, we say, he who sanctifies the Jewish people and the times. And as our sages tell us, God sanctifies the Jewish people who sanctify the times. So the proclamation is given over to the Jewish people. So Kiddush HaChodesh is a mitzvah that is identified with the Jewish people, but with the Jewish people as a nation. Consequently, HaChodesh Hazel Lechem, the first mitzvah of the Torah, is Hachodesh Hazeh Lachem, the proclamation of the new month, the proclamation of the calendar, is the first mitzvah of the Torah, because the Jewish people as a nation are a nation by virtue of the Torah. And Kiddush HaChodesh is dependent, sanctifying the new month is dependent upon the Jewish people as a nation. And the Bezdin Haggalah, and that's what the Baal Torah means. After telling us about the mitzvah of sanctifying the new moon, it says, Dabru, speak, El Kol Adas B'nai Yisrael, to the whole congregation of Israel. Because the proclamation of the new month, of the calendar, is dependent upon all of the Jewish people. And it's dependent upon all of the Jewish people as a nation. So the mitzvahs of the Torah and the Jewish people as a nation go hand in hand. And the Jewish people becoming free, Goy Mikarev Goy, the Exodus represents the formation, the beginning of the formation of the Jewish people as a nation. And it's the Korban Pesach, the sacrifice of the Passover sacrifice that enabled the Jewish people to have that freedom of being a separate nation. So that's one way we could understand that's one way we can understand the juxtaposition between the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh and the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach. But I think there is another way to explain it. And now it's very interesting. The Korban Pesach was eaten in the houses. As a matter of fact, the person wasn't allowed to leave his house the night of the Passover sacrifice. And in Egypt. And not only that, part of the giving of the Passover sacrifice, which was done on the 14th, was to take the blood of the Passover sacrifice with the hyssop and to stain the lintel of the entranceway to the house and the side posts of the doorway to the house. Now, this is similar. Of course, there are a lot of differences, but it's very similar to the way korbanos in general were given in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple. Some of the blood from the sacrifice was sprinkled on the altar. There are many differences, but there is a similarity also. So it seems that there is an identification from the perspective of study, of understanding, of Tam HaMitzvah, between the house in Egypt, where the Jewish people ate the Passover sacrifice and couldn't leave the house, and the sprinkling and the Mizbeach and the altar in the Beis Hamikdash. We have to understand, what is the message that the Torah is trying to give us with that identification? Now, I've discussed in the past the machlokas, the dispute, and really that applies this year. The Gemara in Pesachim talks in the 10th parak about the mitzvah of Kiddush and the mitzvah of Havdalah. And the Gemara tells us that when you have a yontif coming after a Shabbos, so in the Kiddush, we include the Havdalah. And of course, we make a bracha Borei Moreish in the middle of the Kiddush. Usually we use the candles, the yontif candles, for the bracha bar meish. So the Havdalah is included in the Kiddush. But the Rashbam asks a question. But we know that when we make Havdalah, we use psamim also. Or minei psamim. We smell the psamim. So why is it when we have a yontif coming after a Shabbos, when we make Kiddush and we include the Havdalah in it, then we make Borim Reish? Why don't we make a bracha on the psamim also, like people do every time they make Havdalah? And the Rashbam says that the reason why do we use psamim? It's somewhat figuratively. In other words, when the Shabbos is over, and to a certain degree, the neshama yesera, Shabbos has a neshama yesera, a special soul. There seems to be a machlokas, but from the Baal Turim in this past week's Sedra, the neshama yesera seems to be like an additional soul that somehow either hovers over man or enters into man. What is the neshama? According to the Mekubalim, according to the Rishonim, with the exception of the Rambam. I'm sure there are those that agree with the Rambam also. The neshama is a chelik elokai mimao. It's a God. It's a form of godliness that becomes the soul, becomes the soul of man. According to Baal Turim, on Shabbos, a person has an additional soul. The Baal Turim in last week's Sedra, Uvayom Hashvi Shavas Vayinafash. Uvayom ends with a mem. Hashvi ends with a yud. Shavas ends with a suf. Vayinafash ends with a shin. Shtayim. He says it's a remez to the two souls that a person has on Shabbos. Others say, in some of the Lubavitcher material, this is suggested, and some say that the Ramban has this opinion also. Neshama Yesera doesn't mean an added soul, but a Neshama Yesera means that a person is more sensitive. He feels his soul more, or he has the ability to feel his soul in a greater way on Shabbos than on the weekday. That's how others explain it. But whatever it is, the Rashbam sheet. So the Rashbam says, so the reason we need the psamim when we make Havdalah is because the soul of man leaves him, the extra soul of man that entered him on Shabbos, or that he became sensitive to, is no longer there. He's no longer sensitive to it. Motzei Shabbos. So in a sense, figuratively, he's in a state of fainting. The soul is what keeps the person lively. Figuratively, he's in a state of fainting. When the soul, the chelik elokai mimau, the godliness, the extra godliness that he became used to over Shabbos leaves him. He says, but Yontif, he says, also has a neshama yesera. So the soul really never leaves him, the extra soul. Since the soul doesn't leave him, so there's no reason for him to have to make a bracha on the psamim. And Tosas asked against the Rashbam. Tosas' opinion was that there isn't an additional soul on Yontif. So Tosas asks, is that the case? That there is an extra soul in him on Yontif. So why is it that we don't use psamim when we make Havdalah every Yontif? After all, that additional soul leaves us according to the Rashbam. But I think the answer is very simple. My uncle in the Shiurim L'zei Chaba Murray, he said that in regard to a different question, not in regard to this question, he said there's a difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov. He says Shabbos, I'm not going to go over the whole share there. It's a very long share. But he said Shabbos, we talk about Kabbalah Shabbos. Why? He says Shabbos, the Shechina, the divine presence comes to the Jew. God, in a sense, becomes our guest. He enters our household. He comes to us on Shabbos. Yontif, it's the reverse. Yontif, the Jew goes to God. My uncle said, you see, the Shlosha Regalim. We go to the Beis HaMikdash. Under ideal circumstances, of course, we don't have the Beis HaMikdash today. But Yontif, we go to God. We are in God's palace. We are the visitors. I had suggested at one time that we could say Shabbos, to answer Tos's question against the Rashbam. Shabbos, God comes to us. So figuratively, at the end of Shabbos, God leaves us. When God leaves us, that's reason to be faint. So we have to use the psamim figuratively to demonstrate our sorrow that we no longer have that neshama yesera, that extra godliness in us, the godliness that has left us at the end of Shabbos. But by Yontif, God comes to the Jew goes to God. So figuratively, we leave God. When we leave God, we don't have a sense of faintness. When God leaves us, we have a sense of faintness. So at the end of Shabbos, when God leaves us, we take the psamim to demonstrate that there's a certain degree of diminution of the godliness that we feel in ourselves. But Yontif, we leave God. And then my uncle added, he said, Yontif, first of all, you have Rosh Hashanah. I want to get into Yom Kippur now. Rosh Hashanah certainly is, and Yom Kippur also. is Yontif, and there was no mitzvah of Aliyah L'Regel, of going to the Beis Hamikdash. And then in Golas, when we're in exile, people did not go. There was no Beis Hamikdash to go to. So how do we go to God? And my uncle used this terminology. He said, on Yontif, we have to make our house God's house. And in our own house, we become the visitors to God. Shabbos, we talk about Kabbalah Shabbos. We receive the Shekhinah. We don't talk about Kabbalah Shantif. There's a mitzvah of Tosfos Yantif, but there's no sense of going out to receive the Shekhinah. If anything, it's the Shekhinah. It's God's presence that receives us, because we change our house into God's house. And I want to suggest that perhaps that we could say that this is the idea of identifying the house, especially in Egypt. Egypt represented the exiles of the Jew. And in a sense, when they're leaving Egypt, we're leaving the exile. But it's important to remember the exile of the Jew, not just the Jew entering Eretz Yisrael. In a sense, Egypt, the experience of Egypt gives us the ability to survive the exiles of all future generations. To a certain degree, we could say Esav starts his nation right away. Esav nasati esarseya l'reshes also. The Yaakov Avonav Yordu Mitzrayim. Yaakov, before his nation starts, before he has a land, he has to go down to Egypt. Why? Because the Jewish people are a perpetual nation. All other nations, when they encounter exile, they crumble as a nation. But the Jewish people have this ability to survive as a nation. Of course, the Torah plays a role, but the Jewish people begin their formation as a nation in Egypt. And to a certain degree, what gave them that ability was their home. The home, in a certain sense, Espatenu Hitzil, the walls of the home separated them. In the streets of Egypt, there was assimilation. But whatever could be passed down was behind the walls of the home, Espatenu Hitzil. But it's not enough. We have to be able on Yontif, and sometimes even not on Yontif, to turn our house, not just it's our house. Of course, our home has to be our home. It can't be the home of the Egyptians. But it also has to be God's home. And Yontif represents this idea of going to Hachodesh Baruch Hu. And when we're not going to the Beis Hamikdash to fulfill that mandate, we have to turn our home, our house, into God's house, into God's home. And we're coming to see Him. We're coming, in a sense, because Yontif is dedicated to the idea of going to God. And when I mentioned, and that's the Rashbam. So the Rashbam is very easily understood. After Yontif, we don't need the psamim, because after Yontif, we are leaving God. We are leaving God. So we don't need the psamim. However, and so in order to emphasize, but we have to emphasize the idea that Yontif represents the idea not just in going to the Beis Hamikdash, but turning our home into God's home. That's why we identify the home, our home, with the Beis Hamikdash, with the mizbeach, with the altar, and we know that in the altar, we gave the karbanos, but to a certain degree, carbon comes the idea of coming close. We're going to God. Giving the sacrifice is going to God. And we go into our house, which represents the altar, which represents the temple. And when it's not just the carbon that we're giving to God, the carbon is just the symbol. We're giving ourselves over to Hachodesh Baruch Hu. And especially when we leave the service of Paro, we give ourselves, we go into the service of God. We give ourselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We give ourselves over to God. And to represent this idea in Mitzrayim, they would put the blood, of course it had to remain, whereas in the stain had to remain on the doorway, but nevertheless it was reminiscent. Whereas on the mizbeach, he just had to sprinkle it. Whether the stain remained or it didn't remain was irrelevant. But you just had to sprinkle it. So it's the idea that the house, you have to be, it's your house, but you have to be able and ready on different occasions, as symbolized by the Yontif, to turn your house into HaKadosh Baruch Hu's house. We could suggest that that's the reason why Hachodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim, because the proclaiming of the new month, in a sense, is the proclaiming of the holidays. Mekadesh Yisrael Bahazmanim. God sanctifies the Jewish people who proclaim the holidays. How do they proclaim the holidays? Through proclaiming the new month, they proclaim the holidays. And to a certain degree, that represents the idea of us going to God, because by proclaiming the new months, we are proclaiming the holidays. And when I had mentioned this explanation of the Rashbam, I didn't mention the application to Parshas Hachodesh, I mentioned it to one of my very close friends, Dr. Koenigsberg. And he said to me that Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Barditcheva in Kedushas Levi, he's an expert in that sefer. He knows that sefer very thoroughly. And he gives an answer to the Rashbam's kasha in Kabbalah terms. And he showed me the Kedushas Levi, and I said that the Kedushas Levi means the exact same thing that I said. The Kedushas Levi says that Shabbos is mimala lamata. It's from up down, meaning from heaven down to earth. And Yontif is mimata lamayla. That's how he explains the Rashbam. He doesn't explain. Those are the words that he said. I said, what does Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Barditcheva mean? He means exactly what I said. He means to say, Yontif, we go to God. Since we go to God figuratively, When we leave, we are leaving God. So we don't need the psalmim. However, Shabbos, it's mimala lamata. God comes to us. Figuratively, at the end of Yom Tov, God leaves us. So we need the psalmim. And that's the lesson from the Carbon Pesach and Mitzrayim. And that's it is especially important this year when you have a Yom Tov after Shabbos. We have to know it's not enough to allow God to visit us, but we have to turn our house into God's house. And there are many times when we have to practice that to some degree, even on the weekdays. Sometimes because of what goes on the street, what goes on outside the house has to be a house of spirituality. And sometimes that necessitates making our house into Hachodesh Baruch Hu's house. Okay, I think this is the end of this year. We have to end somewhat early today, so I won't be able to take any questions. Okay, I thank you.
Thank you, Rav Moshe.
Okay.